Today's show is sponsored by Indie Film Hustle's Filmmaker Process. We provide filmmakers with professional services to get their films or series funded, finished, and distributed. For more information, go to filmmakerprocess.com. A couple times. Let's jump into Ant-Man. I've always wanted to ask somebody who's been inside the machine, what's it like? Because we've spoken on the show to many directors who've been in, $200 million plus films and, big, blockbusters and things like that. But I've never spoken to anyone who's been inside the Marvel machine. And I know Ant-Man has a lurid history. Like it is definitely there was some issues. Obviously, Edgar left the project for creative differences and things like that. What can you tell us about what's it like without, throwing anybody under the bus, obviously? What's it like working on not just a Marvel movie, but on a franchise like that? Because you're playing in it's like working in Star Wars. Like you're walking into an established universe, and arguably one of the more ridiculous characters in the Marvel universe, who I love, by the way. I mean, Ant-Man, and that's what I love about the script too, in the movies, like they call it out to themselves, like Ant-Man, that's a ridiculous name. But when you guys made Ant-Man work, when I saw it finally in the theater, I was like, well, okay then. They made it work. So what was it like? What was it like being in that machine?
Well, I'd have to say, the Marvel Cinematic Universe wasn't what it is now then. So we started working on that movie in, I think I dug some stuff out here.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a treatment from 2002 for Ant-Man.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The very first treatment that Edgar and I wrote. And so we've been working on it since 2002. Wow. So Attack the Block was 2011.
Mm-hmm.
It came out in 2015. This is on and off. We both made lots of other movies in the interim. But you got to remember, back in 2002, what were the Marvel movies in 2002? Was that even around?
Iron Man had already come out, but they were still fledgling.
Well, one of the first meetings we had, Edgar and I went to Lucasfilm in Marin County, and we went and met Jon Favreau and sat watching the final assemble of the first Iron Man. And Jon Favreau had read our draft, and he gave notes, and Edgar gave him some notes on Iron Man. But that was really the first. Marvel was still handing its big characters to auteur directors
mm-hmm.
in order to fuse that auteur perspective with comic. They were finding the formula, right?
Mm-hmm.
So really, the story of Us and Ant-Man is the story of a studio that changed its agenda and really no longer had the headroom for a writer-director like Edgar who needs to have written every element of his movies. That just wasn't what they would do. By the time we came to make the movie, that wasn't what they were doing anymore. And that's why the final movie has elements of the MCU that were not in our draft. So that's just a story of the history of the evolution of the marketplace, and the story of Kevin finding out what worked. So it's not as dramatic or maybe as sort of thrilling as you might think. It's just a question of times changing, and what Marvel wanted changing, and what Edgar wanted not really fitting in. So in the end, it was, a pretty gentlemanly parting of the ways. Yeah.
And is there a decent amount of what you and Edgar wrote still left in the script? Because you can smell it. You could smell it. It's there. It's not Shaun of the Dead, but you can definitely smell the energy of you guys without question.
Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff. There's a bunch of stuff that I think people think is Edgar that isn't. That's Peyton Reed.
Mm-hmm.
The digressions during Lewis's speeches that were quite stylistically similar to some of Edgar's stuff actually weren't in our draft. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there's a bunch of stuff. As you know, a lot of the design and previs of action sequences happens while you're writing, happens very early. So often that stuff is pretty much nailed down before other writers came in. So yeah, there's a bunch of dialogue, a bunch of action sequences. Yeah, I wouldn't want to put a percentage on it, but there's a lot of stuff there.
So when, and I've heard this from other directors, that when you're working inside the MCU, and the machine is like the action stuff is kind of just directed and prevised out, like almost by itself. Not like this is the screenplay the lead on that, or is someone else the lead on that as far as just building out the action sequences? Because I've heard mixed things from different directors.
Well, I can only speak about my experience, and in Ant-Man, it was all on the page.
Okay.
But on Tintin, when we came onto Tintin, and a lot of the action sequences were prevised already, but they can be tweaked, I mean, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Like Pixar, who, when they have a slam dunk, there's a sort of level of perfection to every single element of a good Pixar film.
Yes.
And that's because they can test run them. They're working in animation, so they can do rough versions, and they can make the film 1,000 times before they release it. And now that movies are so visual effects driven, they're almost doing the same thing, where the movie is made in a previs form and tested before it's shot. So it makes a lot of economic and creative sense to try. It's like people used to do with animatics back in the day, right? Storyboard versions and simple like the more you can test something before you shovel money into actually
hundreds of millions of dollars. Yes, of course.
Yeah. So I don't see it as like this negative thing necessarily. It's just when movies cost that much to make, you've got to have proof of concept in a low cost way as much as you possibly can.
Yeah, I mean, Fincher's famous for prevising every frame, every cut prior to ever shooting. Very Hitchcockian in that way.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. But then, like, there's stuff in Attack the Block action sequences that I storyboarded to the nth degree, and I scouted locations before I wrote, so I wrote to particular locations. But then there are scenes, dialogue scenes, dramatic scenes where I deliberately didn't do that, and I just covered it with handheld cameras. So it depends. And I think often Marvel movies split up like that, or those big action movies, like the action sequences will be done in a more collective fashion, and then the director will come in and deal with the dramatic moments. I don't know, but we left Ant-Man before it started shooting, so my experience in terms of the actual production process is zero.
Got it. So that's just from that point on. To watch the rest of this interview, head over to bulletproofscreenwriting.tv.